When the officers broke the lock on the door hidden underneath the staircase, the smell billowed from the room, brought several of the child protective workers to their knees as they gagged. This would be the most merciful horror they had discovered today. Remember to promise the subscribe button. You'll pick them up a soda from the store so you can have it on hand when it pings you for the next episode. Now, without further ado, let's talk about Heaven's Orphanage. The story begins with Barbara and CeCe Tiller, two women in their mid-30s who had spent the last 13 years happily married. Barbara Tiller was born and raised in a low-income household family with only her father around due to her mother dying when she was still a baby from the sudden onset of an illness. Her father, Logan Burrow, refused to let her grow up without an active parent in her life, so the solution to this was to bring her to work with him every day. He had done this out of love and had been a wonderful wealth of world experience as she'd grown up in a diverse community of adults in the gas fitting trade. If you've never heard of gas fitting, there are people responsible for installing and repairing gas lines and appliances. This often meant that Logan and Barbara would be on the road with the crew due to the fact that expanding use of gas was an emerging industry in 1739. Barbara never attended traditional school due to her father's lifestyle, but she was far from uneducated as she learned to read, write, and the foundations of business operations from the administrators she had spent time with while the crews were on the job too dangerous for her to be around. This exposure would lead to her being a shoo-in to take on an administrator spot in the Wellspring Gas Company where her father worked when she was only 15. Barbara spent a decade with the company until she had met CeCe Tiller at an orientation with the new owners after the Tiller family bought Wellspring Gas Company from the previous owners. CeCe Tiller had been a representative sent from her family, but after a disastrous meeting where she had fumbled through the changes the company would undergo in a new direction of the company, it had been Barbara who stopped the veteran, mid, and senior staff from walking away from the company at that moment. CeCe and Barbara had talked after that meeting, which led to a date that night. A week later, they'd start dating to the excitement of her father and the company staff as they had hoped Barbara would be able to talk some sense into CeCe. These kind of blunders weren't an uncommon scene for CeCe as she had confessed to Barbara. In fact, this had been her last chance to prove to her family that she had been an asset to her family rather than a constant burden. CeCe had been raised among wealth and influence in the western regions of the Chaos Plains in the farming capital of the nation, Treehigh. CeCe spent the abundance of her time with her grandparents due to her parents' busy lifestyles. While her parents were very focused on results and progression, her grandparents were anything but that. In fact, despite having enough to attend one of the many elite educational facilities within the region, CeCe's grandparents had sent her to a local, smaller regional institution called Leviathan's Rising. This specialized education gave her all the foundational skills expected of a school, but didn't focus on developing her critical thinking, which had been the leading cause of many of her failures, at least in her parents' eyes. After CeCe and Barbara had began dating, CeCe had expressed her desire to break away from her family's profit-first legacy and do something that she felt was meaningful in the world. At Leviathan's Rising, CeCe's favorite thing was to go out and help other kids in need. It had been the highlight of her life to be able to do something that really made a difference in somebody else's life. As the weeks turned into months and their relationship grew, Barbara would unveil a plan she had spent many long nights working on. As she popped the question to marry CeCe, there had been no ring, but instead a deed. Barbara had talked to CeCe's family months earlier and proposed the idea of opening an orphanage for children in need. Normally, CeCe's family would have shot this down, but they were actually kind of fond of Barbara and had thought of her as their true daughter that they had never had. It's thanks to her business insights and discipline that had gotten them the money needed to start the orphanage without any expectations of repayment from her parents. On the cool night of September 3rd, 1755, CeCe and Barbara would get married on the steps of their forever home and new orphanage. Immediately after, CeCe would throw Barbara's plans into disarray, as she had unexpectedly wanted to make it a Brimborne exclusive orphanage. Brimborne, for those who are unfamiliar with the term, are children born from the union of a succubus or incubus and a mortal. CeCe's reasoning for this was simple, that when she had been in school, the Brimborne were children that were the most at risk and needed the most support. To CeCe's credit, she wasn't wrong, because even today, Brimborne children face the duality of discrimination in their life. On one hand, people within the Chaos Planes reject their existence as they're part devil or demon and are looked down upon and seen as monsters. Their parents are usually persecuted for making deals within the 10 Hells, and the children often face bullying without much, if any, protection from adults. This usually results in the parents abandoning the Brimborne to escape the stress of the everyday hardships of being a devil's parent. On the other hand, Brimborne are seen as exotic, and their devil parents being the devils of sexual pleasure, Brimborne are often desired for their bodies. This lack of support and demand for sexual services usually pushes both men and women Brimborne into sex work. This, however, doesn't grant them any reprieve from abuse, as Brimborne are often the highest paid, best protected, and given the best treatment of all the brothel girls, which usually puts a target on their back from other sex workers. CeCe wanted to do her part to change that and help the Brimborne children as much as possible. This had been the last thing that Barbara expected from CeCe due to her beliefs and schooling, but she was happy in CeCe's goal to make the world a better place. Barbara smiled, kissing CeCe on the forehead before she headed off to make the changes to her carefully laid plans. Within a few months, the orphanage had easily hit its max of 36 Brimborne children, and Barbara was off to meet another local figure of influence to gather more funds to see if she could find more prospective parents for the children. She had to get ready an hour and a half early because she knew that each child would want to take up as much time as possible to say their goodbyes. She wiped the tears away as she watched CeCe and the 36 smiling faces waving goodbye. Leaving got harder each time for Barbara, as she had found that the children latched onto each other like leeches and had an endless fountain of love to give. After a few days from arriving, the children would quickly open up and seemingly give themselves wholeheartedly to them, feeling the love this refuge and its caretakers had offered. Barbara smiled happily, knowing CeCe had found her calling and she was able to make a difference. A decade passed and hundreds of children came and went, with letters constantly filling the inbox from children who had been adopted and had never forgotten those who had given them a chance. Barbara stepped from the carriage to meet with another gracious donator when she was approached by two investigators and had been taken to the station without a reason. What they would tell her next would shake the western region of the Chaos Plains and destroy the pristine reputation of one of its most prominent families in town history. On the morning of May 4th, 1766, investigators would enter Barbara and CeCe's establishment, Heaven's Final Blessing Orphanage. Locking the place down, they'd head down to the basement and broke the lock to the door hidden underneath the staircase. When the officers broke the door's lock, the smell that billowed out from the room would bring several child care protective workers to their knees as they gagged. Inside, they saw something that could only be described as a story-like depiction of the Dayu. Blood stained the floors and walls, dismembered wings and body parts hung from hooks, and in the center was an altar stained red from its frequent use. As the Brimborne children were taken from the establishment and CeCe was taken into custody while the investigators combed through the bodies, they would find the corpses of over 218 Brimborne children, age ranging from 2 to 15. Everything came to light when a child from the orphanage would run from the House of Horrors into town, where he would tell the story of what he had seen. The following would be the events of what happened from CeCe's mouth. During her time at Leviathan's Rising, she had been shown the truth of the world and how Brimborne were an affront to heaven, and their acceptance into the world was the key reason the angels would come down one day and smite the earth. CeCe had witnessed the evil corruption of these creatures firsthand when she had witnessed her father cheating on her mother with one of these monsters, but there wasn't much she could have done at such a young age. Everything changed when Barbara had gotten the orphanage and realized instead of simply bringing children in and doing good works through that, she could fulfill a much bigger blessing to the world by cleansing the world of these foul monsters. She had not only get rid of them, but sacrificed their souls to heaven so they may be cleansed and given a proper rebirth into the world and serve as fuel for heaven's good works. When questioned about the dismemberment and the seeming torture that CeCe had put these children through, she told them that through her studies that devils were made through pain and could only be unmade through CeCe had conducted her brutal purge by looking through Barbara's guest and meeting logs to see who she had been talking to and where they had come from. If they were foreigners, she would simply forge the documents and bury them among the actual adoptions that took place. To ensure that the Brimborne had as little impact as possible, she would only allow the most useless children to be seen by prospective parents and take those with the most promise to the sacrificing room under the guise of being prepped for a surprise adoption. Barbara had been completely taken by surprise by what she had been allegedly involved in and what her partner had been doing, and easily facing a death sentence for it, and she had pleaded ignorance. Despite no one in the community believing her, it had been CeCe's own admission that Barbara had nothing to do with this whole thing, and everything had been done while she had been away on business. With CeCe's confession, everything moved quickly through the courts, but what happened next would put the greater region into a near state of riot. During the trial, CeCe's parents had gotten the best lawyers in the region, and they had secured a mental insanity claim, putting CeCe's fate into the hands of the mental health professionals in Frontier. They had won this on the basis that she had been brainwashed, and within 2 years at the Correctional Institute, CeCe would be cleared of her mental condition and be set free. In 2 years, the region's most prolific serial killer was freed, and the outrage required the Great Collection to step in and put pressure to impose more safety nets to the mental health claims to ensure that the proper punishments were delivered. Barbara, being cleared of all wrongdoing, would turn the orphanage over to a new staff and enforce better record validation, and personally see every child off until her death 5 years later at her own hands. In her final letter to the world, she had wrote the reason for this action was because of the guilt that she had felt from allowing those deaths of all those children she had genuinely loved under her supervision. CeCe would move back in with her parents after her release, but would turn up dead in her bed from unknown causes 4 months later. No murder had yet been identified for the crime. The orphanage would be funded by Brimborne, who had been adopted and found success in their lives. They had expanded the building's capabilities to include an educational wing, triple the capacity, and included that the staff was diverse for manning each of the facilities. The sacrifice room had actually stayed and was being used as a historical site for the Brimborne children and guests as a reminder of what ignorance and hate can result in. The world is a cruel place where seemingly the nicest people have the most evil plans for us all. If you like this story, check out Unvik's Haunted Forest or the Lady in Green video. All these stories are based on my webcomic and manga series inspired from my homebrew D&D campaigns that I ran for over 10 years. You can read them for free by clicking the link down below, and let me know what you think in my fan Discord, where you can win free commissions from my team just by interacting.